Nate Silver of 538 fame, of polling aggregate fame, has always tried to make the case that data-driven analysis of politics can give us a perspective that dulls the reactive and emotional state that often clouds our judgment and clouds our vision. So why then is Nate Silver attacking Bernie Sanders on social media based on nothing more than conjecture and emotion? Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for stopping by. Look, if you were on social media yesterday, you noticed this tweet by Nate Silver. I'm going to read it out. You get these hints of a sense of entitlement from Sanders, i.e., he feels as though that by virtue of being the runner-up last time, he's entitled to the nomination this time. And if he doesn't win it, it's only because the quote-unquote media slash the quote-unquote establishment took it away from him. So this is very much a non-data, non-quantitative, not even good qualitative research-based argument by data man Nate Silver, who's supposedly all about the evidence of politics and not jumping to conclusions, making an openly blanket statement that Bernie Sanders is entitled or feels entitled to the presidency or feels entitled to the nomination, and that he's going to cry like a little baby if he doesn't get it, and that he's going to blame everybody but himself. And I don't think this is fair at all. I think Nate Silver is like a lot of mainstream journalists, and whether you want to call, Silver a journalist or a data journalist or a statistician who happens to do journalistic things, the reality is he's part of the mainstream media ecosystem. And like much of the people in the mainstream media ecosystem, they have a blatant anti-Bernie bias. So it's no surprise then that Silver is making this largely baseless attack on Bernie Sanders. It's not at all based in what 538 and Nate Silver prides himself on, which is taking our common sense, taking our conceptions, and seeing if the data challenges them or bolsters them. He doesn't do that here. He just throws this out into the wind rather irresponsibly, calling Bernie Sanders entitled, saying Bernie Sanders is something of a, conspiracy theorist because he's blaming the powers that be rather than doing the work needed to win. But here's a couple pieces of data that Nate Silver should consider. Bernie Sanders is unequivocally succeeding thus far in the race. Sure, he's polling in second. He's not leading. If you look at the aggregates, he is behind Joe Biden. But again, it should be noted that data from the New York Times, data indeed, demonstrates that Bernie Sanders not only leads amongst total donors and total amounts of money raised, but has a significant advantage in the breadth of his donorship. That he doesn't have donors and money donated clustered in certain parts of the country, but rather is raising money in red states and blue states and purple states in a way no other candidate, not even Joe Biden, is doing right now. While a lot of other people are clustered in and around their home states and in big donor areas, Bernie is running a truly national campaign of volunteers and donors and supporters. And there's one other piece of data that Nate should consider. Last time, during the 2016 primary, when Bernie was largely running against Hillary Clinton in a one-on-one contest, the Washington Post, full disclosure, I've written for the Washington Post before, largely for their global opinion section. The Washington Post published 16 negative pieces on Bernie Sanders in 16 hours, effectively. 16 negative op-eds and pieces by one of the world's biggest newspapers, one of the United States' most influential sources of information, in one day. It's an incredible attack on a mainstream candidate. And I don't think we've seen anything like it since, and I don't know if we'll see anything like it again unless it's against someone like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is not wrong to suggest that the mainstream media, that the economic and social and cultural elite of the United States is opposed to his vision. There's nothing controversial about that. They are open in their dislike for Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders is open in acknowledging that. This is why he has that anti-endorsement page. This is why Bernie Sanders has made so much about not taking money from billionaires. This is why Bernie is alone among the major candidates for the Democratic nomination in terms of not having one single billionaire cut them a check. Even many smaller candidates have one or two billionaire donors. Even Elizabeth Warren, fellow progressive Elizabeth Warren, has two billionaires who have given her money. Bernie Sanders is under siege from the economic and social and political elite. There's no denying that. That's a fact. But what Nate Silver here is, he's just throwing out conjecture. He's saying Bernie Sanders feels entitled. Bernie Sanders has had to work hard to get where he is. And Bernie Sanders realizes that no individual is entitled to be president. And the only thing Bernie Sanders believes people should be entitled to are things like a good education and good health care and good housing and good employment and good social safety nets. That's what Bernie Sanders believes people should be entitled to. Bernie Sanders believes the only entitlement that anyone needs or deserves is basic human dignity. But Bernie's not entitled to the presidency, nor does he feel entitled to it. And this is just another sort of attempt to suggest that Bernie Sanders is bitter, or that Bernie Sanders is dividing the Democrats, or that Bernie Sanders is running for selfish reasons. But let's be real. The sort of people who feel entitled to the presidency, I think, are the billionaires who are running and the multimillionaires who are running just because they feel that they have something to add because they are rich. And let's be real, some people have suggested that Hillary Clinton felt entitled to be president or felt entitled to the nomination because she had put in her dues and because of her name and because of her lineage and because of her corporate ties and her time as Secretary of State. That it was her turn and no one should have dared run against her. Let's be 100% clear. This sort of journalism, quote unquote, by people like Nate Silver is unacceptable. For someone in his position of power, with his supposed authority being rested in this idea that, we should approach politics in a clear-eyed and quantitative approach, this sort of argument is very troubling. Nate Silver should do better, and frankly, the mainstream media needs to do better. You guys remember when I talked about Mimi Rocha and, the MSNBC segment where she basically said, Bernie Sanders, just makes me feel bad, makes my skin crawl. I can't tell you why. I have no way of quantifying my response and with data or even any kind of good narrative, but I'm going to say it on national, and because it's MSNBC, really, it's international. I'm going to say it on a massive news network, and no one's going to challenge me. None of my co-panelists nor the host are going to challenge my remarks. I'm just going to say it. That's what passes for journalism when it comes to Bernie Sanders. It doesn't have to be based in any sort of fact or logic or even consistent narrative. You just got to say it and then at the very worst, apologize meekly later on once the damage has been done. But we see through it. We see through the naked attacks by Nate Silver and by Mimi Rocha. And we see through the 16 negative pieces in 16 hours by the Washington Post. And we see through the news reports that say, with Bernie Sanders in second, they don't mention him in the headline. They mention the first, third, and fourth place candidates. We see through all of this. And while you might think this is the sort of thing that we're going to do and it's going to craft a narrative in which Bernie is unelectable, or it's going to craft a narrative in which Bernie only exists when there's bad news, that could backfire on the mainstream media because it could give people all the proof they need that Bernie Sanders isn't being given a fair shake by the powers that be. And people aren't going to like that, and people aren't going to respond as the powers that be have wanted them to.